So good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Introducing Buddhism course hosted by the Buddhist Society. Just to remind you, we're on the third of our 7 talks. We missed last week because of the bank holiday, and we will be missing the late May bank holiday as well, but otherwise we're running through as shown here. And so for tonight's talk, we're going to cover one of the very first things the Buddha taught after his enlightenment, which was the 4 Noble Truths. But before we get into tonight's talk, I'm going to remind you that last talk I set some homework for you. I asked you to set a bedtime and stick to it. Now, normally, if we were all in the lecture room, we'd be able to talk about the experiences we had. But for now, for this forum, I'll just run through some of the things you might have experienced if you tried that. Well, the first thing to say is that some of you won't have tried it at all. You'll have said, oh, that's a bit too easy and nothing to do with Buddhism, and I can't be bothered, and that's fine. Some of you will have tried it and found it relatively easy. But what I'm hoping is that the majority of people will have started with a bedtime, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock or whatever. And for the first few days, it's quite interesting. It's something new, something quite interesting to do. And we will have done it very willingly and very happily. But I think for most of you, you will have found as the days went by that resistance started to creep in, because the truth is we don't like being told what to do, even if it's we ourselves that have told ourselves what to do. And for most of us, I think you'll have found when the novelty wore off that going to bed at a set bedtime was actually rather a tedious business, and that you didn't want to do it, and that bedtime would have slipped and you'd have gone to bed at a slightly different time. And I'm hoping what that brings to light is the fact that perhaps I am not in charge, that I'm not actually the CEO in charge of my own life, dictating what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. Because obviously if it was as easy as that, I just want to do something and therefore I do it, then we would have no trouble sticking to our New Year resolutions, taking more exercise, giving up smoking, giving up overeating, all of those things that we'd really, really, really like to do, but somehow we can't quite do it. And that, I think, brings into question this idea that I am in charge and that I can say what needs to be done and that it will be done. In fact, the reality is somewhat different. There's a great resistance coming from somewhere within us to doing whatever it is that we've decided that needs to be done. So that little going to bed exercise, I think, should have perhaps brought that into focus for you. So I'm going to go back a little bit over the ground we covered in the last talk, which was the 3 signs of being, or the 3 characteristics, if you like, of all things that exist. And those 3 characteristics are, first of all, that nothing is permanent and fixed. Everything is in a constant state of flux and subject to change. And although on the one hand we know this, we understand that nothing is fixed, everything is subject to change. On the other hand, we don't like it. We like to think that things that we enjoy are going to last, if not forever, that certainly for a very long time. We like to think that I myself am fixed and that I'm going to be around here in this current state for a long time. We don't like to think when we're in an unpleasant or painful situation we imagine this is also going to carry on and on and on. And the idea that things will come to be and cease to be is really rather alien to us. But everything is impermanent, nothing is fixed, everything is subject to change. This is one of the fundamental characteristics of everything. And yet we cannot recognize it and we cannot accept it. And that is part and parcel of what leads to this general sense of dissatisfaction, suffering, dis-ease, dukkha. The idea that we don't really acknowledge the impermanence of everything. And the third sign of being, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later in this talk, is the idea that things are not separate and independent. Everything that exists is related to everything else, if you like, in a long string of causes and conditions and things that come to be and cease to be, and this leads to that. And yet we don't like that. We like to think that things are not only fixed, but they are separate, and that I myself am separate, that I am separate from you. There is something distinct about me that is different from everything that is not me. But in fact, this isn't true. We can explore that through our direct experience, but just on the surface, we imagine that there is someone home, a chief executive officer, sitting inside my skin, calling the shots. And that is actually in an incorrect way of thinking about things, as we'll talk about a bit later this evening. We also talked last week or the week before about the three fires. These are the passions, these are the emotions, the feelings that drive us round and round this circle of suffering. And these fires, or these emotions, these passions, are attachment or clinging or desire or craving, wanting things, wanting to hang on to what we have, wanting to acquire things that we don't have, that we'd rather like. And then the other side of attachment, desire, and clinging is dislike, aversion, hate, not having things that we don't enjoy, things that are unpleasant. We don't want to have them around us. So this becomes a fire or a passion. And then finally, the deluded, ignorant way in which we view reality. We can't accept impermanence. We can't accept no self, no I. And that leads us to want more. We want to protect this self, this I, me, and mine. We want to push away things that threaten that self. And that deluded view of things is a passion, a fire that leads to suffering. But when people first hear about Buddhism and hear about this emphasis on suffering, people say, oh, you Buddhists, you're such pessimists, always going on and on about suffering. But actually, the way to think about this is that the Buddha is like a physician. The Buddha is a doctor who, yes, he diagnosed the problem. He saw into the problem, which is that there is suffering, there is despair, there is anguish. But rather than just saying, there it is, get on with it, he said there is a treatment for this, there is a cure for this, there is something you can do to change the situation so that you can bring about an end to your suffering. And in this sense, the Buddha can be thought of as a doctor, and the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, can be thought of as medicine. And in the same way that a good doctor will make a diagnosis, will explain the cause of your illness, will tell you whether your illness can be treated, and will prescribe that treatment, This is an analogy for the Four Noble Truths that we're going to talk about tonight. The Buddha diagnosed the problem, which is the noble truth of suffering. He diagnosed the cause of that suffering, which is the origin of suffering. He prescribed a treatment. He said this can be treated. There is a way to lead to the cessation, a way that leads to the cessation of suffering. And he told us what that way was, what was the treatment, the path that leads to the extinction of suffering. And we're going to go into these noble truths in a little bit more detail now, but before I do that, I just want to say a word about the word noble, which when you first come across this phraseology, it sounds a little bit odd. By noble, we mean ennobling. These are truths that will enable us to lead a more ennobled, more dignified, more harmonious life. That's what the word noble means. It means ennobling. These are truths that will lead us towards a life closer to the life that the Buddha led and away from our grumpy, selfish, I-biased existence that is the cause of so much suffering now. So we'll start with the first of those noble truths, and that is the noble truth of dukkha. Dukkha is the Pali word, which means suffering or discomfort or dis-ease, disharmony, that general sense that things are not right, that there has got to be something else that we can do to make things a little bit easier for ourselves in life. And I like this picture because that really shows that just general sense of things just not going our way. And the Pali word dukkha, literally, the origin of that word is bad space, in the sense of the space of a wheel running around an axle. If the wheel and the axle fit nicely together, then the wheel will spin easily. But when the wheel and the axle are not correctly fitted, where there is bad space, dukkha, the wheel will not spin freely. You will have to push it with force. There will be squealing and noise and resistance. And that really encapsulates that sense of life is just not going freely, not spinning along nicely, that we are having to push and force. There is great resistance there, a lot of noise, a lot of discomfort. And that's really where the origin of the word dukkha comes from. And in a sense, it's that feeling that you're constantly swimming against the tide, that things aren't going my way, that I'm fighting and pushing and forcing. That really is encapsulated in that phrase, in that term, dukkha. And dukkha is wrapped up, it's one of the three signs of being, and it's wrapped up with these other of the three signs that I just talked about. It's wrapped up in the idea that there is impermanence, that things are not fixed. That really is a source of great suffering for us, because we'd rather like things to be fixed, particularly if there are things that we quite like. We don't want the holiday to come to an end. We don't want to lose the things that we like, our relationships, the things that we hold dear. We don't want to lose things that are attractive and appealing to us. We don't want to get old. We don't want to lose our health. We don't want to get sick, and we certainly don't want to die. But this is just not how things are. Nothing in this world is permanent. Everything is subject to change, no matter whether it's a building or a mountain or ourselves. Everything is changing. We are in a constant state of flux. Every atom in our body is constantly moving. Our cells are constantly dividing and replicating and dying. And yet we just don't like that. It makes us very unhappy to have to think about that. We want things to be fixed. We want things to be permanent, particularly if they are things that we like. The second of the three signs of beings, which is also feeds into the sense of dukkha, is this concept that I am different from you, that I am sitting here separate inside my skin, that everything within me is mine, everything out there is other, and that I have to protect that self from things that might harm me, that might damage me. I have to build up that sense of self. I spent a lot of time trying to acquire good things to make my life feel more important, make myself feel more important. And yet we are not separate. We are interconnected, intimately interconnected with everything that is. My very existence here is down to the causes and conditions. My parents' DNA coming together to form me, my upbringing, the very chair that I'm sitting on. There was a forest, a tree that grew, the timber was cut down, it made the wooden chair. There is nothing in my life which exists separately without any supporting network of things that brought that thing into being. And yet we don't like that idea that we are intimately interconnected with everything else. We like to think that I am different, I am special. The chief executive officer sitting inside of my skin, calling the shots, seems very real to me. And yet it is not so. This is a delusion. What the Buddha taught is that we are actually made up of component parts. These are the 5 skandhas or aggregates. And that was likened, if you like, to the various pieces of a cart, the wheels, the axles, the handles. In that same way, we are made up of component parts. There is the form, my body, my material sense. There are the sensations, the things that are coming in through my sense organs, the sense of seeing, the sense of hearing, the sense of smell, the sense of touch, these sensations that come into consciousness through those sense organs. I recognize these things. I see the shape of the table. I see the flower. I can recognize that shape, that sense object, and that then leads into thought processes. And we talked about this last time with the story I told you about being bitten by the mosquito, how that set off that pain sensation, recognizing the mosquito, getting that into my consciousness, and then the thought processes, the irritation that I was now going to have a big swollen leg, the annoyance about being made to go on this walk in the first place, etc., etc., etc. So although we know we can see this, yet somehow we think, no, there must be somebody. There is an I, there is an ego, there is a separate self sitting in the middle of this. There is somebody, yes, I'm seeing the mosquito. There is a seer who is seeing. I'm thinking the thoughts of annoyance. There is a thinker who thinks those thoughts. And yet, when you really analyze this, first of all, there does not need to be an I, a chief executive officer sitting inside of my skull, planning and receiving and thinking these things. That is not necessary. And secondly, when you really look for that one, the one who is hearing, the one who is thinking, the one who is seeing, it cannot be found. But unfortunately, that illusion that I have a separate self, there is somebody at home, there is, if you like, a ghost in the machine, is so strong. And that leads us to think not only is there an I, there is a me, there's also a mine, and I must protect that thing. I must protect that from you, from anything that might harm it. And that leads us to do unskillful things, to go and fight with our next door neighbors or do selfish acts because we want to protect this sense of self that's separate from everything and is fixed and is permanent. But that, unfortunately, underpins a great deal of our suffering. And the Buddha said, he described what are the elements of dukkha, of suffering. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha. In other words, that impermanence. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. That really leads back to the three fires, doesn't it? Association with the unbeloved, so getting what we don't want, having to put up with what we don't want is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates, those 5 skandhas, are dukkha. So moving on now to the second of the 4 noble truths, which is the origin of dukkha. Where does this come from? Where does our suffering arise? And very simply, it arises from the fact that we want things. We want things to be different from what they are. We want to have more. We want to enjoy things. And that word for craving, desire, thirst, tanha, really the Pali term has its roots in that thirst. Imagine someone in the desert who's incredibly thirsty. The desire to have water, that is the strength of the desire that we're talking about here. So it's the fact that we want things. Now, what do we want? Obviously we want money, we want a nice relationship, we want to be powerful and famous and relaxed and comfortable. But we also want more subtle things. We want to be happy, we want to be healthy, we want to have justice and wisdom, we want to be wise and harmonious. So we don't just necessarily want material things, we also want some other things as well, which relates really to our sense of ourselves. And in Buddhism, we recognize 3 types of craving or attachment or wanting. So that craving for sensual pleasures, as I showed you in that first slide, sense pleasures, things that make us feel comfortable, craving for wealth, craving for power, but also clinging to ideas and ideals, clinging to the things that we think are important to us, things that we hold dear, our views, our opinions, our theories, our conceptions, our beliefs. The attachment to these things is part of that tanha, that craving, which is part of the cause, the root cause of suffering. But as well as craving for sensual pleasures, we also crave to be something, to big up this little I, this chief executive officer who's sitting here, that deluded sense of self. We really want that to be powerful, to be protected. We want it to have fame, to have influence. But we also want that sense of self to be fixed. We want it to live a long time. We want it to be permanent. We don't like the idea. In fact, we find it really quite abhorrent, the idea that one day all of this is going to come to an end, that we're going to change, we're going to get ill, we're going to die. We don't like that. We are clinging to the idea that I will exist now as myself, and that will go on and on indefinitely. But certainly I don't want to visualize an end to this me, this existence. But also the opposite of wanting things is not wanting things. In other words, wanting to get rid of the things we don't like. So as well as craving for sensual pleasures and craving to big up our egos, we also would quite like to get rid of some things we don't like. We'd like to avoid unpleasant things. We'd like to avoid unpleasant people or situations that make us feel uncomfortable. And that can even go as far as wanting to harm ourselves, self-harm, because we want to no longer be, we want not to exist in this form that we're in. So those are the 3 types of craving from a Buddhist perspective, the 3 types of things that we can cling to or try to avoid. And these are represented in the wheel of life, which we're going to talk about in another talk, by these three little creatures which run around the center of the wheel of life. There is the greed or wanting, which is the cockerel pecking for seeds in the dust. There is the snake, which represents anger or hatred or aversion, hissing. And then there is the pig, which is truffling along, throwing dirt up into its eyes. That represents ignorance. And these three animals go round and round and round because it's delusion or ignorance which leads to grief, to wanting, to clinging, that leads to aversion. And that feeds back into this whole sense of delusion and ignorance. So these three fires are intimately related, one leading to the other, leading to the other. And so it goes on round and round and round. But as I say, the Buddha was a good doctor, and he not only saw that was the cause of the problem, the reason that we were suffering, but he decided to seek for himself the nature of the cause of suffering, but also he found the way towards the cessation of suffering. And he was compassionate enough to teach that to other people. He taught it originally to the 5 ascetics, and then ultimately set out on his long career as a wandering teacher throughout India. So he taught that there was an end. You don't have to be trapped in this constant cycle of likes and dislikes, of anxiety and despair. And that leads to the third noble truth, which is the noble truth of the extinction of dukkha, the blowing out of those fires, the cessation of craving, the cessation of suffering. Now, when the Buddha awoke, when he became Buddha, became enlightened, this was after he had sat for 7 days and nights under that Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. And he came out of meditation on the morning of the 8th day. And when he woke, he looked up and saw the morning star and became enlightened. And he said, how wonderful, how marvelous, all beings are fully endowed with the wisdom and power of the Tathagata, the Buddha, in other words. But sadly, humans, by virtue of their sticky attachments, our likes, our dislikes, are not aware of it. And what he's saying here, and I think this has become slightly missed over the years, is that this isn't something very enlightenment, awakening, getting to the point where you can see things as they really are and live in harmony with how things really are. That is not a special thing that only Buddhas have access to. He said we can all do this. We can all become awakened and enlightened. We can all find our way out of this circle of liking and disliking and suffering. We just have to overcome these sticky attachments, this delusion, this clinging to this sense of I, because what he said was, you are already there, you are already enlightened, you are already awakened, you just don't know it. So I think we have to remember that enlightenment or awakening is not some magical thing that was revealed to the Buddha by some creator. It was something he discovered through his own efforts, and he showed us what we can do through our own efforts to also achieve that state of awakened enlightenment. And we can do it. And this is how we do it. So the fourth of the Four Noble Truths is called the Noble Eightfold Path. And this is the subject of next week's talk. So I'm not going to cover this in any detail tonight, but essentially there are 8 elements to this path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, right meditation. And we're going to go through all of these in a lot of detail next week. I just want to say two things tonight. One is that by path, people often think this means you take one step on it, you master right view, and then next step, right intention. It's not like that at all. These are like spokes of a wheel. We showed the wheel of the Dharma, the symbol of Buddhism, in the second talk. These are all things that we cultivate simultaneously, if you like. And secondly, by right, we almost irresistibly think that means right as in the opposite of wrong. In this setting, it does not mean right as in the opposite of wrong. It means right as in skillful, harmonious, wholesome, leading to a more harmonious way of life. It's not that you have to do things because these are right and doing the other is wrong. That isn't actually, that isn't it at all. These are harmonious, skillful, appropriate things or characteristics for us to cultivate. And I really like this slide, which I would just like you to ponder, because this starts to show how these elements all fit together. So we have the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the cause or origin of suffering, which is craving or attachment, the fact that there is a possibility of cessation of suffering, and the path that leads to that, which is the Noble Eightfold Paths. And just to give you a little bit of a taste of what we're going to talk about next week, is that those 8 elements to that path can be broken down into 3 main, really called 3 pillars of Buddhism, if you like. So there's the elements which constitute wisdom, so right understanding what we're supposed to be doing with our Buddhist practice, right thought or right intention or right motivation is also part of wisdom. And then there are the 3 elements which make up ethical conduct, so leading a good life, if you like. So correct speech, correct action, and right livelihood. We'll talk about all of these next week. And then there are the mental disciplines, so right effort, right mindfulness or awareness, and right concentration. And I'm going to go through all of these things in a lot more detail next week. This is just a little taster for you. So there you have the 4 noble truths: the noble truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the extinction of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the extinction of suffering. Now, when we see those words, 4 noble truths, people tend to think these are truths that you must simply believe if you're going to be a Buddhist. But actually, I said at the very beginning of the course, the Buddha did not ask us to believe anything just because we were told it. This is not dogma. So rather than thinking about these as truths, as facts, as things you just have to take on trust and believe with blind faith, no, these are actually challenges to action. These are things you are supposed to work with and act upon. So yes, the first noble truth, there is suffering. We have to understand what is meant by suffering. We have to recognize that there is suffering and what that term dukkha, what that encapsulates. So we understand suffering. The origin of suffering is desire or attachment. We should practice to let go of that. Now, by let go of it, I mean not indulging ourselves by saying, yes, I rather like these nice things around me and I'd like to have more of them. But it's also not denying ourselves either, not becoming too rigid and saying, no more chocolate biscuits, sleep on a hard bed, wear a hair shirt. No, that would be also wrong, because that would be pushing those things away. And anything we push away, gives power over us, doesn't it? What we try to cultivate is the ability to let go of these desires, to let go of these aversions, to accept that our desires are there, but not act out on them, and ultimately they will lose their power to beguile us. Realizing that there is a way that leads to the cessation of suffering. And by realizing in this sense, I'm using the word realizing as one might realize an asset. This is something that we can use and transform for our benefit. So there is a way that leads to the extinction of suffering, and we have to understand that, let go of the causes, and realize that there is a way that leads to the cessation of suffering. And then finally, cultivating the path that leads to the extinction of suffering. So actually getting on that path and walking it, not just thinking about it and hearing about it and talking about it, but actually doing it. So let's not accept the Four Noble Truths as Buddhist dogma and say, yes, 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 I will accept and believe those. That isn't what the Buddha taught at all. We have to act upon them. These are calls to action. These are not just gobbets of facts that we have to swallow and believe in. I'm going to just go on now to something else. When the Buddha taught these Four Noble Truths, this was the first thing that he taught. If you remember, when he first came to his enlightenment, he thought that what he had discovered was so profound that nobody would believe it, nobody would understand it, there would be no point in sharing it. But ultimately, he went and found those 5 ascetics who'd been practicing with him, practicing those great austerities, and decided to go and teach them some of what he had learned, what he had discovered. And it said that when he first came into view, initially they thought, oh, there's that soft lad Gautama we thought he was a tough ascetic like us, and then he decided to drink some rice porridge and have a bath in the river. But then they saw that he had this natural authority, that something had changed, and they apparently they got up, they rose up to meet him in respect because they saw something about him. But anyway, the first thing that he taught them was the Four Noble Truths. So this was in the Deer Park at Benares. So this was the very, very first of the Buddha's teachings, the first turning of the Dharma wheel, as it's called. But the second thing he taught them was about the middle way. And I'm going to tell you a story which illustrates the concept of the middle way. And this is called the parable of the lute. And this is in one of the Buddhist sutras. And this concerns a monk called Sona, who was meditating alone in the forest during the time of the Buddha. And he was a very diligent meditator, trying very, very hard with his practice, but he was getting very frustrated because he felt he wasn't making any progress. And he got very frustrated and went to see the Buddha to find out why he was getting nowhere and why he was not being successful in his practice. And the Buddha said, Sona, in earlier times, were you not a great musician skilled in playing the lute? And Sona said, yes, Lord, I was a musician. And the Buddha said, well, tell me, when your lute strings were stretched very, very tight, was the lute tuneful, and did it make good music? And was it easy to play? And Sona said, no, it wouldn't make nice music and it wouldn't be easy to play. And then the Buddha said, and when the strings on the lute were saggy and baggy and too loose, then was the lute tuneful? Was it easy to play? And Sona said, no, it wouldn't sound good at all. And the Buddha said, so when, Sona, the strings of your lute were neither too tight nor too loose, when they were adjusted to an even pitch, did your lute then have a nice sound? Did it sound good? Was it easy to play? And Sona said, yes, it would be. If the strings were of the right tension, then the lute would be easy to play and it would sound good. And the Buddha said, similarly, if you apply energy too strongly, it would lead to restlessness, And if the energy is too lax, it will lead to lassitude. Therefore, keep your energy in balance, and the spiritual faculties in this way will focus your attention. So in other words, the Buddha was teaching something called the middle way, neither too harsh nor too lax. If you are too hard on yourselves, no chocolate biscuits ever, I'll give up eating meat, I'll get up at 4 a.m, I'll meditate for 8 hours a day, that will eventually lead to discomfort and lack of progress. On the other hand, if you never make any effort at all, go every which way, do whatever you like, and not do any practice, then that won't work either. And don't forget, the Buddha himself experienced these two extremes. When he was Siddhartha Gautama in the palace, he experienced the life of utter luxury, and that did not give him what he was looking for, which was the cessation of suffering. And then he became that very fierce ascetic, meditating to the point of death. And that didn't give him the answer either. So neither a life of super luxury nor a life of terrifically grim austerity was helpful for him. And that's why he taught the middle way. Let's do things to the right tension, not too tight or too loose. And what he said was, these two extremes ought not be practiced by one who has gone forth from the household life, in other words, by a monk. So we don't want to be addicted to indulgence of sense pleasures, which is low, coarse, the way of ordinary people, unworthy and unprofitable. Nor do we want addiction to self-mortification, which is painful, unworthy and unprofitable. Avoiding both of these extremes, the Tathagata, the perfect one, the Buddha, has realized the middle path, the middle way. It gives vision, gives knowledge, and leads to calm, to insight, to enlightenment, and to nirvana. And what is that middle way realized by the Tathagata? It is the noble eightfold path and nothing else, namely right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So the Noble Eightfold Path is the middle way, and that is what we follow. So we'll talk about the Noble Eightfold Path in detail next week, and you will learn what those 8 elements are and how we cultivate them. But before we wrap up for this evening and move on to questions, I'm going to set you some more homework. So you don't need to go to bed at the set time anymore. That was last time. We can do something different this time. So this is your homework. I would like you to sit quietly in a chair for 15 minutes. Now, this is not a meditation exercise. I'm not asking you to meditate. Some of you may be good at meditating. Some of you may have not had any experience of it. I'm not asking you to do that. I just want you to sit quietly in a chair for 15 minutes and observe what happens. Just observe. So I'm going to leave that there for now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we have about 10 minutes for questions, if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Yes, we do have some questions in the chat. So the first question is asking, if the idea of practice in Buddhism is to alleviate suffering, isn't that in and of itself a want? I also don't understand how humans will be motivated to create, learn, grow, etc. if they wanted nothing.
There's a difference between desiring something and, you know, for the greater good of humanity, of sentient beings, etc. In other words, trying to lead a good life, and wanting something for my own benefits. So there is a difference between, it's that essence of selfishness relating to that sense of I, of ego, of I, me, and mine. If we analyze our motivation carefully, and right motivation, right intention is one of the elements on the Noble Eightfold Path. If it is driven by a desire for something for me, then it is probably an unskillful thing. So yes, we can certainly have preferences, we can have wishes to do things, we can try to improve our lives and the lives of others around us. But once it becomes tainted by that need to protect this ego, this sense of self, this sense of selfishness, if you like, then it is an unskillful situation. So if we can do things selflessly with compassion and a desire to help all sentient beings, that is fine. But once it's driven by a need for something for me, then you're just basically feeding into, strengthening that delusion of I, which is underpinning the suffering here.
Thank you so much. The next question is asking, how is the path of the Buddha related to Hinduism, also in terms of the life story of the Buddha?
Well, this is a good question because, of course, the prevailing religion when the Buddha was in the Buddha's lifetime would be Hinduism. And to a certain extent, there are elements of Buddhism which grew out of Hinduism. And we're going to cover a couple of those elements in a future talk. We're going to talk about karma, and we're going to talk about rebirth. These are elements which were originally Hindu teachings, and in fact even earlier than Hindu teachings. So there was a great deal of the elements of Hinduism which became incorporated into the Buddhism that was the religion that was practiced in the Buddha's day and shortly after the Buddha's death. And of course, as Buddhism spread into other parts of the world, it incorporated elements of other cultural traditions and religions that were prevalent. So, for example, the Tibetan school of Buddhism has incorporated a large number of elements from the prevailing religion of the Bo religion, which was part of the prevailing religion at the time that Buddhism came to Tibet. So Tibetan Buddhism looks rather different from Theravadan Buddhism and very different from Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism was the Buddhism that moved through China and incorporated many elements of Taoism, and that then got incorporated into the type of Buddhism which is now called Zen Buddhism, which is prevalent in Japan and in Korea. So yes, Buddhism grew out of a base in Hinduism, and as it's moved on through various other parts of the world, it's picked up other things along the way. So you'll see a lot of elements of Buddhism which have their roots in Hinduism. And we'll talk about, as I say, karma and rebirth are the two big ones that come to mind, but there are important differences in how Buddhists view rebirth, for example, in comparison to how Hinduism views rebirth. So one thing that's a big difference between those two religions is that the Hindu religion has a belief in the soul, that something can be reborn from life to life to life, whereas Buddhism does not recognize any such concept. So there are differences, but there are certainly very strong echoes of Hinduism in Buddhism.
Thanks a lot. The next question is asking, are monks who practice celibacy giving power to the concept of sensual cravings? Is this not a contradiction of the idea of letting go of suffering?
I haven't totally understood that question, but essentially, some monastic traditions do require the monks to be celibate. But within, for example, within Zen Buddhism in Japan, many Zen priests are married and have families, so they're certainly not celibate. So celibacy is not a necessary requirement of Buddhism, nor is vegetarianism, for example. People talk about this a lot. If I'm going to be a Buddhist, I have to be a vegetarian because the Buddha was. Well, actually, the Buddha wasn't. The Buddha ate what he was given, and there are no specific rites or rituals around celibacy or vegetarianism or other things that are a requirement for Buddhism. But what we will talk about next week when we talk about right action is we will talk about some of the moral codes, if you like, within Buddhism, which ask us not to not indulge in sexual relations, etc., but not to abuse those relations. So there's a big difference between having a loving sexual relationship with someone and having an unpleasant, dominating, abusive relationship with someone. And that's what we're asked not to do, to refrain from doing when we undertake a Buddhist path, is to not to give up all sensual pleasures, because that's not the middle way, but to use those sensual pleasures appropriately and not go to extremes. So not abusing other people, not intoxicating ourselves so our minds become clouded through drink and drugs. So we'll talk about those things next week, how you can practice a Buddhist life without having to be a teetotal or a celibate or etc. You can do those things, and it's about how to do those things skillfully without overindulging, but at the same time without completely denying yourself. That would be the other extreme.
Thanks a lot for your answer. The next question, Alice is asking, I'm interested in mental health safeguarding around meditating alone without the benefit of a community and an in-person teacher to ask while the center is closed.
Well, there are courses, aren't there? There are classes that you can join. At the moment, they are on Zoom, but there are meditation classes, I think, pretty much every day of the week. Clearly, once the center reopens again, you'll be able to come in person. But I would encourage you to join a group for meditation. You will get strength from the other people within that group, just as they will get strength from you, mutual support. It is always very, very helpful to have a teacher who you can ask questions of. So while the center is closed, then please join the Zoom classes so that you get engaged with a meditating group. But you're right, meditating alone, particularly if you have concerns about mental health issues, etc., there can be difficulties there. So I would ask, ideally, that you would meditate with a group, join a class, even if it's on Zoom for now, and then ultimately come to the society in person. That will be more helpful. Because yes, if you're alone and you're meditating, yes, things can come up that can be quite difficult. So yes, please do join one of the Zoom classes now and then come to the society when it's open.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. Do we have time for?
Yeah, we've got 2 more minutes, yes.
Okay.
So a couple more.
So Kate is asking a question about the homeworks. So for the homework, any recommendation on sitting, morning, night, same time daily? Or am I making this more difficult than it needs to be?
Yes, well, it's not a meditation exercise. So I don't want you to meditate. I just want you to sit. And it depends really on how that fits into your schedule. You can try it in the morning, you can try it in the evening. It doesn't really matter. I just want you to sit and observe what happens. There's no right way of doing this and there's no wrong way. I just want you to see what happens.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
I think we can take one more if you have one.
Okay. Yes. So, what is the difference between a ritual and routine?
A ritual and a routine. Well, a routine can be very simple, can't it? I have my routine every evening when I'm cleaning my teeth. But a ritual has a lot more kind of religious elements to it, doesn't it? You can end up, you have to dress in a special way, and there are often religious symbols have to be involved, you know, candles or wheels or beads. Before you know where you are, if you start adding those symbols, those religious elements, you are very quickly in the world of ritual rather than routine. That's probably too simplistic an answer, isn't it? But rites and rituals to me mean things that have religious trappings. So if you go into a Buddhist monastery in Tibet or Thailand, you will see things there which look very like you might see in a church or a synagogue. You'll see symbols, you'll see Buddhist statues, you'll see paintings on the walls. People will be doing things in a particular way. They'll be bowing in a particular way. They'll be sitting in a particular way. So there is quite a lot of ritual has crept into the different schools of Buddhism. And that's fine. And for some people, that might be extremely helpful. They are obviously very different from school to school. What we're trying to focus on here in this course is the core elements of Buddhism that are common to all of those schools. But once you start adding in those ritualistic elements, you'll find that the Zen school, the Tibetan school, the Theravadan schools, they all start to look quite different. But the religious symbols might make you think of, you know, churches, might make you think of synagogues, might make you think of those other things, those religious elements that come in. And they're certainly helpful, but the core teachings, the elements of Buddhism that are at the root of all practices don't really need any of those rituals and rites. Actually, we can just do it without those things. It's gone past, so I'm going to stop there and remind you that next week we are going to cover the Noble Eightfold Path, so the detail of how to actually start your Buddhist practice. But please, if you can, sit in the chair for 15 minutes and observe. That would be great, because I'm going to have some things to talk about your experience when we speak next week.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you.